Still Scotland after all these years. The oldest standing house in Northern Europe is Napa Hauer, dating from 3500 BC. The people who were the first Scots left very little behind them. They must have been hardy folk to endure the climate and other challenges. It may be that the first of Scotland's hunter-gatherer peoples were all but wiped out when a large chunk of Norway fell into the sea, causing a tsunami with a wave of over 100 feet high. Then came waves of Celtic peoples from the Euphrates Valley, so the Basques came to Spain and the Bretons to France. Then over the course of many years they came to Cornwall, Ireland, Wales and then Alba, probably around 500 BC. The people who lived in Ireland called them the Crithna, wheat growers. The Picts. They decorated standing stones, upgrading the stone circles left by their forebearers. Let's just stop a moment. No one living or dead can tell a totally true story of anything that ever happened. Everyone sees things from their own perspective. If you've just written a book on Scottish history, you will promote that as being the truth, and you will view it from where you are. This is a very thin representation of a huge chunk of time. Check out the wonderful films of Some History Stuff, where Bretons came from retreating Romans in and around the 380s AD, which is a very different story from the one I just told. You can find them on YouTube at Some History Stuff 4859. Even to this day, most people anywhere on earth have a place they call home, and they go to work not far from there, and their children go to school not far from there, and they go shopping not far from there. Once in a while they visit an aunt or a friend who live in the next town, and once in a while they go on a long journey on their holidays. A few people travel a lot, and they go from one hotel to another hotel. Most people's lives are led in a very few square kilometres. In our modern world, we can be in touch through the internet with people anywhere on the planet, but most people just visit folk they know, who are friends, and they stay around the corner. There's not really a lot you can do if there's a flood in Australia. In the distant past, once the hunter-gatherer lifestyle had been swapped for farming, their lives were no different, except they did not have a car. Life was local. Who was king and queen, or in charge of the big bit of land that your bit was in, really meant little in comparison to whoever was the chief of the village. The first minute 20 seconds of this film and the next 90 minutes are merely a compressed narrative to give an idea of what went on before we were all here. The suggestion is that you stop and start and read deeper and more widely. Like one of those Russian dolls, there's a smaller one inside, and there's always another part of the story, deeper inside. Oh, and people in the past were not always fussed about the ownership of bits of land. Often groups gathered about a leader, and being a part of the group that supported that person was more important than a bit of land or property or treasure. Then the Romans came, and to try and keep the Picts under control and in their own homeland, they built Hadrian's Wall, and a bit later they built the Antonine Wall. And then their empire began to fade, and they disappeared off back to Rome. Alongside the Picts, the Dalriada were rising in prominence. Then splashing across the Irish Sea by way of Iona came St. Columba, bringing Christianity. And then the mighty Kenneth MacAlpine appeared to unite the Caledonians and the Picts and the Dalriada, and he joined us all together, Scotia, Caledonia, Alba, into what was the beginning of what we now know as Scotland. In 899, Donald II, became the first king of Alba. The Vikings were here, there and everywhere, and King Canute was forging an empire through Europe, up through England, and he'd overtaken the lowlands of Scotland. Canute was a genius in his field. He was so revered that people thought that if he told the sea to go back, it would. Of course, anybody can tell it to go back twice a day because tides come and tides go. But probably what Canute did say was, look, if I stand by the shore, the sea isn't going to go anywhere just because I tell it to. Canute overran the southern part of Scotland and met with Malcolm II, Malcolm the Destroyer, at Stirling, where the Firth of Forth could be crossed. Malcolm paid fealty for the southern part of Scotland of 1 serf, 1 cow, 1 horse, and 1 bushel of meal. And although he did it with his fingers crossed and didn't really mean it, that small piece of history turned into a large piece of history, because every English monarch thereafter has claimed paramountcy over the whole of Scotland for that one act. Some of Scotland's royalty from Malcolm the Destroyer: Duncan I, the Bleeder, Macbeth McFinlay, Thorfinn the Raven Feeder, Queen Gruach, Lulac, Malcolm III, Canmore the Big Head. Despite the bad press and lies in Shakespeare's Scottish play, Macbeth, son of life, was a great king of Scotland. King for 17 years, he brought forward laws. He supported the Church of St. Columba and went to Rome to ensure the Catholic Church did not dominate in Scotland. It is said that he introduced the Clydesdale horses from Belgium and that women were given some rights. He put his stepson forward as his heir. Queen Margaret was wife of Malcolm III, Malcolm Canmore, the Big Head. She became known as Saint Margaret of Scotland. William the Conqueror, William I of England, the Norman, threatened King Malcolm III in 1072. Malcolm III did what Malcolm II had done, saying that William could be overlord as Canute before him. The Queen's Ferry, Firth of Forth, established so pilgrims could visit Queen Margaret's embryo abbey at Dunfermline and the Romish shrine at St Andrews. Margaret was a founder of Dunfermline Abbey, and she was buried there in 1093. Malcolm III may well have instigated the Highland Games, ordering men to race up Craig Connacht at Braemar to find the fastest runner in Scotland to be the royal messenger. A letter from 1703 summoned the Laird of Grant to Highland Games. His clan arrived in Highland coats with guns, sword, pistol and dirk, which possibly indicates competitions with arms to find the bravest and the strongest. Musicians and dancers were encouraged. Which clan could provide the finest? After 1745 in Culloden, wearing Highland dress, speaking Scots, playing pipes, Highland dancing, much of Scottish culture was forbidden. But it is not possible to repress great things for too long. Now there are almost 300 games worldwide each year. Malcolm III was killed in Alnmouth in 1093. His eldest son was injured at the same time and died in Jedburgh. Many of the pictures in this film were made long after the people they depict had passed on. This is Donalbain, Donald III, Donald the Fair. He was caught up with William Rufus, the English king, who wanted Duncan to be king, Duncan II. And there were battles, and Duncan did become king whilst Donald had to leave. And then Duncan II was murdered, so Donalbain returned. Then came King Edgar, who started the Coldingham Priory. He was followed by Alexander I. A storm capsized Alexander's fishing boat, and he was washed up on Inchcolm. He founded there an abbey. In 1124, King David I came to the throne of Scotland, the youngest son of Malcolm III, Malcolm Canmore, the Big Head, and Queen Margaret, St. Margaret, of the Queensferry Crossing and Dunfermline Abbey. Before he became king, he started the Selkirk Abbey, which later moved to Kelso. He imported many Norman families: Bruce, Stuart, Lindsay, Fraser, Comyn, Cumming, Balliol, Bailey. The Normans built stone castles, which was an innovation. David also provided Scotland with feudalism, sheriffdoms and boroughs, and Scotland's first coins. David needed educated people to run all of these infrastructures. Universities were yet to come, so he built abbeys, because monasteries and abbeys could provide education. There were other abbeys: Urquhart, Rosemarkie, Fern. The abbeys educated, farmed, manufactured, mined coal. One day David was out hunting around Arthur's Seat near Edinburgh. Separated from the main part of his party, save a chaplain, a wounded stag charged him. But David wore around his neck Queen Margaret's fragment of Christ's cross, the Black Rood. The chaplain waved the Black Rood at the stag, thus preserving David's life, and so the Abbey of Holyrood was founded. Malcolm IV, the Maiden, gave up Scotland's Cumbrian and Northumbrian lands to King Henry II of England. Scotland's 7 Marours, the petty kings, rebelled. Malcolm died in 1165, and King William followed him. We remember King William because of the Lion Rampant. Alexander II, King of Scots, 1214 to 1249. He was involved in getting King John of England to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, and also for establishing the Scots-English border through the Treaty of York in 1237. The debatable lands were still very much debatable, but that border has been in force more or less since then. Alexander got himself in trouble with Pope Honorius III, and he was excommunicated. Over several hundred years, crusades took place. To put it simply, wars between the Christians and the Muslims. Many Scottish nobles, kings and princes went to fight in these conflicts. His successor, Alexander III, was only 9 years old when he became the king. On several occasions, King Haakon IV of Norway sent forces to Scotland to try and regain the Western Isles. At the end of Alexander II's reign, an invasion force was sent, and then in Alexander III's reign, there was a battle at Largs. Thomas the Rhymer was probably Scotland's first Macker. He was known for his prophecies, and indeed he prophesied that King Haakon would be defeated, and indeed the king died on his homeward journey to Norway. The first part of Alexander III's reign was dominated by various regions. The last of these was Sir David de Lindsay. When Alexander III came of age, Sir David de Lindsay went on a crusade. He died of a fever. A Scottish monk embalmed his body and returned it to Scotland, and as a reward, the first Carmelite abbey was founded in Aberlady. Edward I is known as the Hammer of the Scots. He reigned from 1272 to 1307. He went on crusade, fought many battles. He conquered Wales and spent much time in Scotland. The most important job for the spouse of a monarch was to provide an heir for the throne. It wasn't easy to have children in those times. Indeed, Edward's wife, Eleanor, had 16 children. One daughter died at the age of 29, another at the age of 35. One reached the old age of 58, another one died at 53, and another one died at 34. She had one son, who was named Edward, and he became Edward II. He was murdered by his wife at the age of 43. But she had another 10 children, who all died as infants, 62%. Imagine what life must have been like for those without the luxury of a royal household to cosset them. Yolande of Dreux married Alexander after his wife Margaret died. Yolande had no children. Alexander had no direct heir. The next in line for the Scottish throne was the Maid of Norway, Margaret. However, she was only 3 years old. She didn't live very long. She died in 1290 when she was 7. The Guardians of Scotland signed the Treaty of Bergen, a marriage of the Maid of Norway to Edward Carnarvon, who was son of Edward I of England and would become Edward II. The treaty declared that Scotland was separate from England and that its rights, laws, liberties and customs were wholly and inviolably preserved for all time, so that the marriage did not cause a union of Scotland and England. Civil war was the outcome of the death of the Maid of Norway. Bruce versus Balliol Comyn. The island of Iona was the place where many ancient Scottish kings were laid to rest. The petty kings, the Morors, or English might say earls, they would meet there and decide which of the royal lineage would take on the role of next monarch. With the death of Margaret Maid of Norway, the Morors Buchan, Menteith, Strathairn, Lennox, Ross, Athol and Mar were unable to come to a decision. They decided that a jury should decide, and asked Edward I of England to conduct the court proceedings. The Scots formed alliance with Eric II of Norway and Philip IV of France. The Old Alliance came into being. Scots had dual nationality with the French, and the alliance against England that was renewed many times has never been revoked. 266 years until 1560, and then the Treaty of Edinburgh, which is the point at which some say the alliance ceased. Edward had demanded that Scotland contribute towards his war with France. The Scots made an alliance with the French and attacked Edward at Carlisle. Edward's response was to attack Berwick-upon-Tweed, at that time Scotland's greatest seaport. Edward's English army slaughtered 17,000 people, children, men and women. Edward installed the weaker of the two candidates, Balliol, as opposed to Robert the Bruce. Edward summoned all of Scotland's nobility to pay homage and to sign what was called the Rigmarole, worthless document. Balliol was then banished to France, and Edward was the King of Scotland. Edward stole what he thought was the Stone of Scone and the Black Rood which had belonged to Queen Margaret and that had saved King David I's life. Of course, we all know that Angus Og took the Stone of Scone, the real one, to the Western Isles, and that's probably where it is till this day. History is a very slippery thing. In the modern world, we can see just how easy it is to manipulate information, to try and slant what happened in favour of this or of that. When the Romans were about, they had plenty of folk to record what they were up to, and they left loads of physical items behind. They left a dearth of such talent when they left, And that is why the period of history after the Romans left this part of the world is known as the Dark Ages. There is a tendency to look back, using the knowledge of what we now know, when history really needs to be viewed through the lens of what people knew then. It is puzzling that with all that humankind now knows, it still refers back to the distant past and is anchored to the views and opinions expressed in scrolls written when people had less knowledge about everything than we have now. It is hard to interpret what went on 1,000 years ago, how people did what they did, how they felt about things, or even what their physical circumstances were. It is probably fair to guess that our ancestors were very hardy and very strong and a lot less picky than folk are today. Our view of the past could be changed and challenged by new discoveries. Some of our past is based upon totally wee fragments of unverifiable information. There was a poet by the name of Blind Harry. His work about William Wallace is all but the only source of knowledge available of one of Scotland's greatest heroes. It is known that there was a battle at Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September 1297. William Wallace and Andrew Murray won the battle against the English. Wallace was made a Sir and then a Guardian of Scotland. Andrew died of his battle wounds. So commenced the First Scottish War of Independence. Here are some notable figures from that period. Edward I, Edward Longshanks as he was called, that means long legs, didn't like all that stuff with Wallace, and of course he had him captured and taken down to London. And this is a picture of an interpretation of what it was like at his trial in Westminster Hall. Certainly his execution wasn't very pleasant, and here's a plaque to mark the place where it happened in August 1305. It's now time in this great story of Scotland for Robert the Bruce to step forward, but there was unfinished business from the time when Edward I made John Balliol the king and then sent him packing to France. The Commons had to be dealt with. For the killing of John Comyn, Pope Clement V excommunicated Bruce, but he was crowned King of Scotland on the 25th of March, 1306. Edward I of England died the following year in July. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. The 23rd and 24th of June 1314, King Edward II of England lost the battle to Robert the Bruce of Scotland. Independence for Scotland was achieved. However, Edward refused to give up his title of Overlord of Scotland. The Declaration of Arbroath was drawn up. It was sent to Pope Jean XXII. He received the declaration and rescinded Robert's excommunication, and from then on addressed Robert as the king. The Declaration of Arbroath, part of a campaign to assert Scotland as an independent kingdom and not a feudal land controlled by England's Norman kings. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. The Battle of Stanhope Park was a disaster for Edward III of England's regent, Roger Mortimer, and it led to the Peace Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which was signed in 1328 between the kingdoms of England and Scotland. The First War of Scottish Independence ended. The terms of the treaty stipulated that in exchange for £20,000 sterling, the English Crown would recognise 1. The Kingdom of Scotland as a totally independent country. 2. Robert the Bruce, his heirs and successors were the rightful rulers of Scotland. 3. The border between Scotland and England was recognised as in the reign of Alexander III, 1249 to 1286. Robert the Bruce died on the 7th of June 1329, aged 54, at Manor of Cardross. On his deathbed, Bruce put his 5-year-old son David in the charge of Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray. He charged Angus Ogg with the safekeeping of the Stone of Scone, which is even now hidden in the Western Isles. Bruce charged James Douglas that once Bruce was dead, Douglas would remove his heart and take it with him on a crusade. Douglas did so, held safe in a silver casket about his neck. The brave heart. When the young King David II began his reign, Edward Balliol, son of the empty-coat Toun Tabard, as they called him, John Balliol, Edward I's puppet's king, who had been banished to France, returned to claim the throne, and the Second War of Scottish Independence began. The wars continued for 28 years and finished in 1357 with the Treaty of Berwick. The English won this round, extracting a ransom for King David II, whom they captured at the Battle of Neville Cross. 1371 brought the House of Stuart to Scotland with King Robert II. He reigned until the 19th of April 1390, and he passed away at Dundonald Castle in Ayrshire. Much of what is called history is measured in the lives of queens and kings, maybe because they had the power and finances to allow their doings and misdoings to be recorded. Very little is recorded of the Knight Soilman, who may well have had an interesting tale to tell. This is a précis of a part of the story of Scotland, and does not really consider the wider world. Before he became king, Robert III was named John Stuart. Before he became king, he was kept captive in the Tower of London by England's Henry V, who took him to the wars in France to discourage Scottish attacks due to the Old Alliance. He wrote poetry and was Scotland's High Steward, the Earl of Carrick. Robert died in 1406. St Andrews University was founded in 1413. In 1424, the Scots Lead language replaced Latin as the official language for recording statutes and for all official business in Scotland. And in 1429, Scottish soldiers went to the aid of Joan of Arc. King James I of Scotland was assassinated in 1437. Glasgow University was founded in 1450 and Aberdeen University in 1495. Then there was James II and James III, and that brings us up to 1503. James IV married Margaret Tudor, the daughter of English King Henry VII, in 1503. The marriage meant that Scotland's royal line now had a direct link into the royal line of England. Henry VIII worried of this, being unable to produce a viable male heir. On the death of England's Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, there was no suitable heir in England, and so James VI of Scotland became James I of England as well. This is a picture of a model of King James IV's flagship, the Great Michael. At the time, it was the largest ship afloat. James IV honoured the Old Alliance in support of Louis XII and went to war with English King Henry VIII. James IV died on the battlefield for Lodenfield in 1513. During the reign of King James IV, Scotland gained the printing press, the Royal College of Surgeons, the palaces of Falkland and Holyrood were commissioned, Compulsory schooling became law. Royal income doubled. The Crown controlled the Scottish Church. There was a treaty of the Perpetual Peace, improving things with England. Scotland's navy was developed. He spoke Gaelic, Latin, French, Spanish, Flemish and German, and was a patron of the arts, and he was even interested in dentistry. The first mention of Scotch whisky is in the Exchequer Rolls of Scotland, 1492. 2 years later this appeared, to Friar John Core by order of the King, to make aqua vita, water of life, whisky, 8 bowls of malt, enough to make 1,500 bottles. Exchequer Rolls of Scotland, 1st of June, 1494. Aqua vita in the form of wine or spirits was also used for making gunpowder, to moisten the slurry of the saltpetre, charcoal and sulphur. Spirit production was first taxed by the Parliament of Scotland from January 1644. Excise duty of 2 shillings 8 pence was imposed per Scots pint. James V was 1 year old when he ascended to the throne. Of course, whenever this kind of thing happened, many people stepped forward wishing to be regent, and other countries wished to take advantage. The history of Scotland at this point begins a new phrase, one which still resonates when football teams Rangers and Celtic meet. It hangs around Orange Order marches and has divided society in Northern Ireland, and much pain and suffering has come through it. Martin Luther's 95 Theses pushed on the reformation of the Catholic Church in Europe, and the reformers gathered in Switzerland. Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich during Lent 1522 told his congregation to eat sausages, something forbidden during Lent by the Roman Catholics. This started the Reformation in Switzerland. This is Capellum Albus, where the Wars of the Reformation happened in Switzerland, 1529 and 1531. Henry VIII was desperate to get a male heir, annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. He took on the Reformation, which was gathering pace around Europe, and he ushered in the divine right of kings, king being God's representative on earth. We'll come back to the Reformation things a little bit later, but getting back to James V of Scotland, he had 2 wives. The second one was called Mary of Guise, and she had 3 children. 2 boys died and a girl, and the girl became a very famous character in Scottish history, Mary Queen of Scots. James V had trouble with Henry VIII of England, who tried to make him leave the Catholic Church and become a Protestant. Pope Paul III gave James the title Defender of the Faith for resisting Henry's attempts. He was held captive by the Red Douglases for 2.5 years. He had a lot of construction work done at Falkland and Holyrood. At the Battle of Headon Rig against Henry VIII on the 24th of August 1542, James won. The Battle of Solway Moss did not go so well in the November. James died in the December, and his remains are in the vault at Holyrood Abbey. The first surviving major text in Scots is by the 14th century poet John Barber, The Bruce, the life of Robert I. Football is Scotland's national game, although in 1424 an Act of Parliament prohibited it. This law fell into disuse, but was not repealed until 1906. There is evidence of schoolboys playing football in Aberdeen in 1633. The riding of the marches. In the 13th and 14th centuries, during land border wars with England and against other clans, in the border country it was custom to plunder and thieve cattle, known as riving or robbing. The laird appointed a leading townsperson to ride the borough's boundaries or the marches, to protect the common lands and prevent encroachment by people from neighbouring lands. 2 curling stones dated 1511 and 1551 were found when an old pond was drained at Dunblane. They can be seen at the Sterling Smith Art Gallery and Museum. The first written reference to a contest using stones on ice is in the records of Paisley Abbey in February 1541. There are two paintings, Landscape with a Bird Trap and Hunters in the Snow, both dated 1565. The sport was also known as the roaring game because of the sound the stones make when travelling over the ice. They say that in the 13th century, enemy warriors were approaching a soldier's camp in the dark of night. One of the enemies stepped on a thistle and cried out in pain. The noise alerted the Scottish army, who were roused and could defend themselves. So the thistle became a Scottish symbol. The thistle was used by Scottish reformers on banners and flags. It represented opposition to the English crown. Now it is a symbol of Scottish pride. Old Hansel Monday, celebrated on the first Monday after 12th of January in the Julian calendar. Hansels were gifts that were given on this day to children, servants, delivery people, etc. Hansel is a Saxon word to deliver into the hand, referring to tips, gifts, money, tokens of good luck, particularly gifts to mark the start of something like a housewarming present. The gifts should not be sharp or things that could cut for fear of cutting the relationship between the giver and the recipient. A new purse had to contain some money to ensure good luck for the year to come. The days between Christmas and Hansel's Day, including Hogmanay, Near's Day, which was New Year's Day, were often known as Daft Days. There were two acts of the Estates of Parliament which abolished Christmas holidays, declaring Yule celebrations and customs extinct. They were in 1640, repealed partly in the 1686 Act, and then abolished again in the 1690 Act and partly repealed by the Great Britain Parliament in 1711. Christmas holidays became a bank holiday in Scotland in 1871.